I'm inviting Father Luke to say our invocation prayer. Father Luke, please.
Thank you. I should perhaps explain what I'm doing here. I am the chair of the Ecumenical Commission of the Archdiocese of Newark, and Monsignor Rodano, who is a member of our commission, I must say, a stellar member of our commission, invited me to do this. Let's join our minds and our hearts in prayer. Lord Jesus, risen from the dead and alive forevermore, we greet you, present in our midst by faith and in the power of the Spirit, as we gather for this lecture. We know that the desire for unity touches your own heart as you live the Paschal mystery. For so you prayed on the eve of your Passion, that the scattered children of God might be drawn into one, and that all may be one as you and the Father are one, and that those who believe in you may be one, so that the world may believe. Like Cleopas and his companion on the road, on the evening of that same first day of the week, we ask you to stay with us on the ecumenical journey, because we often overlook and tend to forget all that has been endured and achieved by those who served before us, the fruits that have been born and harvested in service of your prayer and in fidelity to it. Foolish people of weak faith and slow to believe all that the former prophets spoke and did, though we are, we ask you, stay with us. When we feel downcast and disheartened, open our eyes and our hearts to the testimony of the Scriptures, and let us recognize that the Paschal mystery is marked throughout the lives of those who believe in you and in their labors. Let us see again and again the opportunities that, though unsuspected or yet unrealized, lie before us. Help us to be undaunted by the challenges, but rather believing in your desire and knowing your victory. Inspire us to be faithful and to return to the company of the disciples with the message of hope reborn in you. We ask this of you, Lord Jesus, living and reigning with the Father in the unity of the Spirit, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you very much, Father Luke, for that beautiful prayer. So, thank you, friends, for coming to this very important event. I am Dr. Ines Murzanko. I am a professor of religion and also the director of Catholic Studies program and also the founding chair of the Department of Catholic Studies. Of course, we are here to celebrate the legacy of Archbishop John J. Myers. On July 24th, 2001, John Paul II, actually Saint John Paul II, appointed Archbishop Myers as the 5th Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Newark, our Archdiocese, and the 3rd Superior of the mission Sui Juris for Turks and Caicos. There are 10 anniversaries that we are celebrating today. First is the inaugural of the Archbishop John J. Myers' annual lecture series on law, society, and faith. Actually, the first lecture was in December 2013. So here it is, 10th anniversary. Since then, we have had distinguished guests delivering this prestigious lecture series. 10 years that we are celebrating the legacy of the Archbishop, but also we are a diocesan university, the oldest diocesan university in the United States. That the continuation of that intimate relationship with our archdiocese is really incarnate in this lecture series. Of course, our university was founded in 1856 by the first Bishop of Newark, James Roosevelt Bailey, and it is the oldest diocesan university in the United States. 10 years since the establishment of the Department of Catholic Studies, which came with in tandem, I can say, with the Archbishop Myers lecture series. And it's the department that is offering, for 10 years actually, all these events, and especially focusing on ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. Also, there is another 10th that we are celebrating. It is the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis being Pope. He was elected to the See of St. Peter's on 13 March 2013. A lot of 10th anniversaries, actually. And we are very grateful that we are celebrating. Also, there is another big one, anniversary. It is the 25th anniversary of Catholic Studies at Seton Hall University. And again, we will have more celebration for this landmark in the history of Seton Hall University, both the center and the program in Catholic Studies, working very closely together. They are 25 now. So Catholic Studies has established itself at Seton Hall University as a place of encounter, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue. A month ago, Pope Francis had an audience with the rectors, professors, administrators, and students of the Pontifical Roman universities. The Pontiff renewed his idea of the university. I'm quoting here. Indeed, the university is a school of harmony and consonance among different voices and instruments. It is not a school of uniformity. No, it is one of harmony and consonance among different instruments and voices. Pope Francis more and more is using harmony, harmony, harmony in his speeches. So, Pope Francis's invitation to the university to renew the commitment for an encounter is very real, and this is what we are doing at Seton Hall University in Catholic Studies in this case. And also Pope Francis said another key word that I took very much to heart. The university should sing as a choir. Beautiful. I'm still discerning this and how to apply it, right? So this is to sing as a choir, harmony, is a serious call for Catholic universities in a special way and is in line with the main topic of our lecture today, ecumenism. Openness in truth and love, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue. Now I'll invite my colleague and dear friend, Monsignor Rodano, to introduce our very special, distinguished speaker, Most Reverend Bishop Brian Farrell.
Don't clap for me. So we have with us a distinguished guest today, Bishop Brian Farrell, who is the secretary of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity in Rome and vice president of the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with Judaism. And this dicastery that's called the Secretariat, called the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, was created in 1960 by the Pope who at the same time called the Second Vatican Council. And he wanted the Second Vatican Council to take the question of unity, Christian unity, seriously. So he created this secretariat to help him to do that. And the Secretariat, later called Pontifical Council, now called Dicastery, for promoting Christian unity, contributed greatly to the council, and it helped the council in the creation of 4 of the 16 documents that the council produced: the Decree on Ecumenism, the Declaration Nostra Aetate on relations with the Catholic Church and other religions, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, the document on unity with the Theological Commission of Vatican II. So those 4 documents are very important and set new directions for the Church. And this Secretariat, now Dicastery for promoting Christian unity, has helped it in that work, and helped to implement those documents. When the Secretariat Dicastery for Unity was started in 1960, there were virtually no contacts between the Catholic Church and other Christian churches and communities. Today, because of the work of that office, there are now international dialogues and contacts, stronger or weaker, with virtually all the major Christian families, and a good partnership with the World Council of Churches. So in 1960, when I entered the seminary, there was nothing. And now, these many years later, there's a great deal which we owe to this Dicastery for promoting Christian unity. Bishop Brian Farrell has served the Holy See in perhaps a unique way for some 40 years. Beginning in 1981, he began service to the Vatican Secretariat of State, and especially the English language department of that Secretariat. So in that capacity, he helped to prepare the many trips of Pope John Paul II to various parts of the world, and traveled with the Pope on those apostolic journeys. So for 20 years he worked in the Secretariat of State. And then in 2002, he became Secretary of the Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity. All the Vatican offices have a cardinal, president, and a secretary. The cardinal and the secretary work together in order to implement the work of that office. And so Bishop Farrell has been involved in that. With Cardinal Kurt Koch, he and Bishop Farrell direct the Catholic Church's international work for Christian unity and oversee all of the international dialogues and activities. Bishop Farrell has also personally served as a member of a number of those dialogues. There are about 15 or 16 of major dialogues going on now. And Bishop Farrell, from the flyer that has been produced and distributed, has been involved in the dialogues with the Orthodox Church, with the Anglican Communion, with the Malankara or Indian Oriental Orthodox churches, with the Salvation Army, and he is a member of the joint working group between the Catholic Church and the World Council of Churches, and a member of the International Catholic and Jewish Liaison Committee. Bishop Brian has also a younger brother, a kid brother, who's a cardinal. It's Cardinal Kevin Farrell. He's prefect of the Vatican Dicastery for the Laity and Family Life. And so the Farrell family of Ireland has served the papacy and the Holy See intensely for decades. It's a very unique thing, I think. And so it is against the impressive background of ecumenical work that Bishop Farrell has done that he will speak to us today about topic is Challenges and Opportunities in Ecumenism, a Catholic Perspective. Bishop Farrell.
Believe me, I haven't paid him to say these things. But thank you, Dr. Woodsacco, for inviting me. And I really feel privileged to be able to speak today about the ecumenical efforts of the Catholic Church at the moment. I thank all of you for being here. I tell people that since I began working in ecumenism, I only meet good and dedicated people. And that's true, so thank you. I have prepared the text here. I'll try to make sure that I keep within the limits of time, because I really believe that if we have a few minutes for questions, it will be much more interesting in the sense that questions bring out the practical things. But as everybody here knows, the ecumenical movement as a shared intentional search for unity has been around for just over 100 years. And for a little over 60 years, the Catholic Church has been an active partner in efforts to restore that unity. Still, in spite of all these huge efforts that are being made, we're still divided. As St. Paul says, as if Christ himself were divided. However we envision the unity that we're working for, it seems to be far off into the future. But what counts, and what makes me happy to be here with you, is that Christians and their churches not lose sight of that final goal, and actively pray and work and walk together to achieve it. In this presentation, I need not spend much time on the past history of the ecumenical movement. Many good things have been achieved. Steps towards fuller communion have been achieved. But the challenges, as the talk is entitled, the challenges and opportunities, I could try to make a list and say, these are the things that help, but these are the things that don't help, as if we were looking at it from the outside. On the other hand, I thought, well, suppose we try to observe it from the inside, and as it were, take the pulse of the ecumenical movement, and try to understand the dynamics at work in the advances and in the obstacles on the way. So we may ask, are we getting closer to Christian unity or not? The question driving this reflection is the same one posed by Pope John Paul II in his famous encyclical on ecumenism, Odunum Sint, 1995. Quanta est nobis via? In other words, how much further do we need to travel, I'm quoting the Pope, until that blessed day when full unity in faith will be attained and we can celebrate together in peace the holy Eucharist of the Lord. Or to quote Cardinal Casper in his famous Harvesting the Fruits, I quote, after more than 40 years, now they're 60, of official ecumenical dialogue, it may be asked, where are we? What has been achieved and what still has to be done? What are the unresolved questions that still need to be taken up? So let us try to take stock of where we are and set our gaze on the way forward. I'd like to say something by way of introduction. In other words, we are not, as Catholics, we are not where we were at the time of the Second Vatican Council. A different perspective on other Christians and their communities, brought in by the Council, became possible because of a remarkable change of vantage points. Much depends on where you're looking from. the way you see things. It happened by beginning, not from what had divided Christians down the centuries, but from what had always united them. Their common baptism, incorporation into Christ, and the gift of the Holy Spirit. That is enormous. At that fundamental level, all the baptized share in the same grace. But not only that, as the decree on ecumenism says, the separated churches and communities as such have by no means been deprived of significance and importance in the mystery of salvation. For the Spirit of Christ has not refrained from using them as means of salvation. So instead of looking out at some sort of ecclesial void outside the Catholic Church, Catholics were now called to see their Christian brothers and sisters as dearly beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, at their churches and communities as joined together in varying degrees of real ontological communion. Real. So now let us reflect a little on how the change came about. How we understand the church depends very much on the ebb and flow of ideas that emerge in the collective consciousness in the course of time. Vatican II came at a time when important concepts that belonged to the long tradition of the church were being represented as a correction of certain ideas and practices introduced in the Latin Church we're talking about during the last segment of that history. Let me show what was happening with an example. I could fill it out with many more. The great Yves Congar, the great ecclesiologist, so influential at the time of the Second Vatican Council, in his Journal of the Council, has an entry for the 30th of November 1962. The first session of the Council is working on. That morning, he had a testy meeting with Cardinal Ottaviani. And he writes, I quote, "I perceive that I am once and for all and forever under suspicion. That will not prevent me from working. My work displeases them because they realize very well that its whole aim is to bring back into circulation certain ideas, certain things that they have been endeavoring to shut out for 400 years, and above all for the last 100 years. But that is my vocation and my service in the name of the gospel and tradition." In the name of the gospel and tradition. By appealing to tradition, Congar here was calling for attention to the diachronic whole of the church's tradition, of the church's self-understanding, including the millennium of the undivided church, East and West, and not just the last segment or the post-Trinity pyramidal structure of governance in the Latin Church. Actually, I was delighted to hear Pope Francis just a few weeks ago say exactly the same thing. I quote, "It is a question of recovering an integral ecclesiology, as it was in the first centuries, where everything is unified by belonging to Christ and by spiritual communion with Him and with one's brothers and sisters." And this is the important part. Overcoming a sociological vision that distinguishes social classes and ranks and is ultimately based on the power assigned to each category. One of the moral miracles of the Second Vatican Council lies in the fact that in the 3 years that it took to discuss and approve the ecclesiological documents, Lumen Gentium and Unitatis Redintegratio, for example, the vast majority of the bishops, most of whom had been educated in that exclusivist Catholic ecclesiology moved from that juridical, sociological conception of the church to a much more spiritual, theological, and liturgically based conception of the church as communion. This is something that all commentators realize, but it's very important that we who work in ecumenism keep it in mind. The very idea of what the church is extremely important if we're going to work for its unity. Ecumenism then, in the Catholic view, is all about making, and I'm quoting Pope John Paul II, making the partial communion existing between Christians grow towards full communion in truth and charity. We already said that we are in partial but real communion because of our common baptism, life in the Holy Spirit, and now we're working to bring that to completion. So what is happening at the Dicastery for promoting Christian unity? What are we doing? As well as doing what is possible to keep the ecumenical task alive in the Catholic Church and dedicating much energy to building solid relations with other Christian churches and communities in visits, meetings, shared initiatives, all kinds of activities, the Dicastery is engaged in 15 bilateral dialogues at the international level. Now, you can imagine this involves a whole series of people, theologians, ecclesiologists, other disciplines. It means organizing all of these dialogues, which generally speaking, in a general way, meet at least for 1 week every year, and they continue. We have a whole library of documents and documentation of all of these dialogues. I won't go through them one by one, you'll be here till next week. But let me say that we're working at 3 levels, if you wish. First of all, the East, the Orthodox, and the Oriental Orthodox. And then secondly, relations with the communions, all of which directly or indirectly depend on the Reformation. And thirdly, recent developments, charismatic, Pentecostal, evangelical movements. So let me start quickly with the Oriental Orthodox. You know who they are. Those churches that from the first centuries flourished at the margin or outside the Roman Empire. This is very important because they were not part of the common history we have with the Byzantines. These, for example, are the Coptic, the Syriac, the Armenian traditions. The theological dialogue that began with all of them together as a family in 2003 is continuing. It's a confident, progressive discovery of how much, after 1,500 years of separation, we have in common. And I would say that this dialogue, because it is not burdened by a deep and prevailing psychological sense of rupture with Rome, and this is something that those of us who actually take part in the dialogues, we feel it. There's an element that is not just about ideas, but there's an element of my history. And with the Oriental Orthodox, there is no history of them breaking with Rome. They just grew up, or they broke with the East, and not with the West. As a result, this dialogue is making quick progress, really and truly. The desire for unity is very strong. And personally, I believe that it is now the Catholic side that has to clearly state what is required, what we think is required for unity. And in this, I would also remember the memorable words of Joseph Ratzinger when he was a theologian. Nothing more can be demanded than was actual in the early church. So we Catholics have to adapt our way of looking at things. Many people who are engaged in ecumenism at a practical level think that what we're trying to do is to make them like us. No. They are perfectly church as they are. We have to find a way of living with them. With the Eastern, the Byzantine Orthodox, the dialogue, because we have so much in common, the dialogue aims directly at Eucharistic celebration. This is the aim. This is what we want to get to. So there was a first phase in which the dialogue developed all the mutual common understandings of faith and life in the church, especially of the sacrament of order in apostolic succession, which we recognize and have no problem with. There is full agreement around this vertical dimension of ecclesial unity, what it means to be church. But Eucharistic communion also requires communion horizontally. In other words, that we be together in collegial communion between the churches, between their bishops. So in the second phase of the dialogue, the question of authority and conciliarity. How is the church structured around the question of authority? And with special attention to the role of the Bishop of Rome, insofar as disagreement on that role, the Petrine ministry, lies at the heart of the separation between East and West. So, in the first phase, 2007, we had an agreement that we call the Ravenna document, because it was signed in Ravenna in Italy. There exist three levels of the church: the local, the regional, for example, in a country, or we have the National Conference of Bishops, for example, and then the universal. Now, we agreed that at the universal level, the first among the bishops is the Bishop of Rome. This is the tradition of the first century. This is the order of the churches. And the fathers of the church all recognize this. But then the question is, okay, you may be the first, but not the way you are. So the question becomes the exercise of the role of the Bishop of Rome. So in the latest Catholic Orthodox agreed statement, which is called Synodality and Primacy During the First Millennium, the Commission decided to examine how that authority was exercised in any universal way. And after developing all of this, it says that primacy and synodality as exercised in the first millennium can give vital guidance to Orthodox and Catholics in their efforts to restore full communion today. Now, the big question came, the second millennium, when we were already separated after the 11th century, years of study, many failures along the way. We have had a number of meetings in which we couldn't agree on the text of the documents, of the agreed statements. So we have a working group that has now prepared a document on the second millennium. Second millennium is very difficult because West went one way and East went the other way, and we developed two different modes of being church. This could be a defining moment. We will have the next plenary of the Catholic Orthodox Dialogue at the end of May in Alexandria. And we will discuss this paper, and we hope that we can make some progress. I am not sure that we will have at the end of the meeting a fully agreed document. It's very difficult. And it has become infinitely more difficult because of the tensions within Orthodoxy. Tension between Moscow and Constantinople because of the church questions in the Ukraine. And now that has become a major question for all of us because of the war in the Ukraine. And the fact that the Russians will not attend any meeting at which the representatives of Constantinople are chairpersons or conveners of the meeting. So we have a very difficult future in the immediate years and maybe for long years in our theological development, ecumenical development with the Orthodox world. On the other hand, we have the greatest friendship and activity and cooperation in so many ways. I mean, I have seen, for example, the relationship between Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew. I mean, they are like two people who have known each other for forever. And I was just thinking, we had an event, I forget if it was 2000 and just before COVID, an event in Rome, and there were a number of churches represented. And we're going to meet in the hall that is above the entrance to St. Peter's Basilica. It's a big hall. And we're going up there. And next minute I see Pope Francis and Bartholomew moving off into a corner and having a chat on their own. Nobody knows what they said. In other words, there is that kind of immediate relationship. They can talk to each other whenever they wish. But at the theological level, we will have these difficulties that I just mentioned. Okay, let's move on. What about the Protestant world, which is probably what you are more familiar with, and my dear friend Diane here is a perfect representative. We have worked together for many, many, many years in many different meetings. So we are involved, the Dicastery is involved in 11 ecumenical dialogues with communities deriving from separations in the 16th century or later. And these are, I'll just list them so you'll be impressed by all the work we did. Old Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, Reformed, Mennonites, Baptists, Disciples, Pentecostal and Charismatic Movement, World Evangelical Alliance, conversations with the Communion of Protestant Churches in Europe, and the Salvation Army. So all of these have constantly need for experts from the Catholic side to come together with their experts to develop these dialogues. So the dialogues are bringing, little by little, are bringing to light the much that we hold in common. But since I'm supposed to talk also about the obstacles on the way, let me mention that we are facing a number of obstacles. One of them is a very general thing that I think influences everything that we do in ecumenism, and that is the general cultural world that we are living in. It has been called the liquid society. So we agree because we don't take things seriously. It doesn't matter if we disagree, we just do it. Well, from the point of view of Catholic theology, that is not the way forward. So we're going to have to continue to insist that the doctrinal theological questions are important and we have to work at them. The other thing is that, and this happens in all churches, including our own Catholic Church, there's a weakening of confessional identity. In other words, we don't relate to what is fundamental in our own tradition. And therefore, we're not in a position really to gauge the relationships and the differences between the churches. And therefore the conversation becomes, I don't mean to be negative about the word academic. They become academic in the sense that they are beautiful reflections on all kinds of doctrines and practices. But at the end of the day, the church doesn't feel that it's engaged. The church as such has to move towards unity, and not just the experts in the room. And this is the problem. And then there's the problem that with different ecclesiologies, you have different goals about what unity entails. We are, in a certain sense, we're a great ecumenist that Jack and I know, maybe, and also Diane. Bishop Scheele of Würzburg, who was very instrumental in the Catholic Lutheran world, and in the Declaration, the Declaration on Justification. What did he say? He said this: regarding unity, we agree that we want unity, but not on what kind of unity. And this, in a certain sense, is the big challenge that we have today. The heart of the task that remains, I should see how much time I have. The heart of the challenges that remain today with all of the partners in the West is related to how we conceive the church and the ministry, and therefore also the Eucharist. Take, for example, the question of mutual recognition of ministry. This is a very sensitive, central point in the ecumenical discussion. What formal, officially designated ministry is required? Who has authority to teach and lead in the church? And how is this transmitted? In this, let me summarize it by saying simply, practice has gone beyond simple denial. For example, I use the example when I explain this to people who don't really follow the ecumenical work closely, but I say, well, what do you think that Pope Francis, when he sees the Archbishop of Canterbury coming, he's thinking, this is a layman dressed up as a bishop? Of course not. Of course not. He recognizes a ministry. He recognizes that this man is a witness of revelation, that he is working for the spiritual salvation of his people. Of course he does. Otherwise they wouldn't have gone together to South Sudan so recently. But our theology needs to find the language to be able to recognize that. And we don't have it. And especially the mindset, the Catholic mindset, and even more so to my friend from the East, the Orthodox mindset does not have the language and the culture to find the way in practice to give space to that ministry that we recognize. I mean, we do on a practical level, but what I'm saying is on the theological level, we still have a lot of work to do to find the proper language. So this is also a major challenge in our ecumenical work. So let me move on and say something about how we are looking at the future. Looking to the future, much of what is now going on in ecumenism will continue because it's the right way to go. There's much that is valid and necessary in the way Catholics engage in the ecumenical movement. Friendship and collaboration between the churches at the local and the national level create the climate that makes growth in communion possible at the global and theological level. What we call the dialogue of life and love creates the context for the dialogue of truth, which of course has to continue into the future. So let me be very specific, let's say, and mention just two concrete opportunities. One, a long-term question, deeply theological, and one, a short-term one, a pastoral one, for the future of ecumenism. The first, but it's not the only question, but it's fundamental. The first, the specific attention to the role of the Bishop of Rome in a united church. A question that looms large on the ecumenical horizon in East and West, and will have to be addressed on the way to Christian unity. Every pope since John the 23rd has recognized that the role of the Bishop of Rome as universal primate constitutes a serious challenge on the way to the unity of Christians. This consciousness is clearly expressed, for example, in Pope John Paul II's request in Nocturnum Sint, and I quote, that we may seek together, of course, the forms in which this ministry may accomplish a service of love recognized by all. This is a huge challenge for us Catholics. There have been many responses to that invitation of John Paul II. And it has come up in many theological dialogues and all kinds of conferences and studies and so forth. So the Dicastery has now prepared a kind of harvesting of the fruits of all these developments. Until now, we had no synthesis of all the responses to that question. Help me to find a way to exercise this ministry of love and unity that is acceptable to all. So we've developed this document. It's entitled The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in Ecumenical Dialogues and in Responses to the Encyclical Udunum Sint. And the idea that, the fact that Pope Francis has inaugurated a synodal process, a synod on the synod, seemed to us like the best occasion to present the results of all this development down the years. So we have a document and a proposal, which we shared confidentially with a number of expert theologians from the different Christian traditions. Excuse me. Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, as well as with the members and consultors of the Dicastery, of course. And the revised document was then sent to competent dicasteries of the Roman Curia. In total, we had more than 50 written responses to our document, which we then incorporated into the text itself. So most Catholics look at papal primacy as an absolutist authority in a world church. And I would even say that most of us, in a certain sense, want it that way because it makes it easy for the rest of us. The relocation of papal teaching and authority and governance within the context of conciliarity and synodality. In other words, as an authority in service to the communion between the churches, is a crucial part of the emerging consciousness at the heart of the reform that our church is undergoing. Ecclesia Semper Reformanda. In his first encyclical, Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, had already written, I quote, "I must think too about a conversion of the papacy. It is my duty as the Bishop of Rome to be open to suggestions which can help make the exercise of my ministry more faithful to the meaning which Jesus Christ wished to give it, and to the present needs of evangelization. And at the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Synod of Bishops in 2015, he laid out a certain vision. I quote, "The Pope is not by himself above the Church, but within it as one of the baptized, and within the College of Bishops as a bishop among bishops, called at the same time as successor of Peter to lead the Church of Rome, which presides in charity over all the churches." So the challenge is to present Catholic teaching on primacy in the light of a communio ecclesiology, and within the framework of the hierarchy of truth called for by the Second Vatican Council. Now, if you're familiar with history, the history of doctrine, you'll remember Vatican I. So this vision of relocating the papacy in the context of conciliarity and synodality implies a rereading of Vatican I, especially a revisiting of the way it was received in the Catholic mindset. Even the introduction to Pastor Aeternus, which is the decree of 1870 at the First Vatican Council, even there it calls for the doctrine of papal primacy to be understood, I quote, "according to the ancient and constant belief of the universal Church." So Vatican I has to be seen in the light of Vatican II and the intervening magisterium, and in the context of a growing ecumenical convergence on the biblical foundation and theological significance of primacy and synodality. The proposal goes on to affirm the need to distinguish between the theological essence of the Petrine ministry, the fact that God intended the Bishop of Rome to have a universal role in service of unity and truth, and the historical contingent development of its exercise in the course of time. In practice, a clearer distinction between the different responsibilities of the Pope as diocesan bishop, primate of the Latin Church, and universal pastor. These are not novel ideas. They're not something just invented a few weeks ago. They appear in many, many commentators of Vatican II. What is somewhat new is the explicit formulation by Pope Francis that such a reform needs to be intentionally pursued and can't be postponed. Finally, the proposal suggests that the Pope himself has to speak and act in such a way that his ministry may be a service of love recognized by all. We all know that down the years, gestures and statements of symbolic actions of successive popes have been crucial in building a climate of trust with representatives of the other churches. I was at a meeting of Christian World Communions last year in Vancouver, and these are the highest representatives, let's say, the Secretary Generals of all the churches, all the way from the Orthodox, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, all the way through the whole spectrum of Christian churches. Very different among themselves, but I sat listening to all the Secretary Generals, and I was amazed at the number of them who quoted Pope Francis in the sense that Christianity has need of a spokesperson. And this is part of the role that they would gladly recognize if the rest of it could be put together. And they actually do in practice recognize that when he does address certain problems in the world, that they are very much in agreement and they are thankful that he has said what he has said. So in that sense, theology is part of a journey. It's not the whole journey. There are other elements of the journey that need to be fostered and promoted. As Pope Francis himself, he's very much aware of this. He has said, the ecumenical journey has allowed us to come to a deeper understanding of the ministry of the successor of Peter, and we must be confident that it will continue to do so in the future. For the East and for the West, this is a theme that is central to the search for Christian unity. And without progress in this issue, the ecumenical movement will be at a standstill. We have to face these questions. Sorry, I marked myself the time. 2 minutes. I said that we would talk about the role of the Bishop of Rome. That's a long-term project. But there is something that's coming quite soon. 2025 is the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council recognized by all the churches. So here we have a huge opportunity. Why? Because Nicaea is all about the fundamental belief of Christians that Jesus is man and Jesus is God. Without this, there's no Christianity. So maybe the anniversary will become a time when we can all stand together and say, I believe. And that would be a huge step in the ecumenical world. The other point is that Nicaea was the first time that all the bishops were invited to come together to make decisions. Synodality. It was the first universal, if you wish, expression of conciliarity and synodality. So if we could, in our own church, develop the synodal process in a proper way, and that's another speech that could be made, we would be in a great position to have an extraordinary celebration of the Christian faith in a way that is common to all of the churches. I dream that we will have an event in which all of the heads of all the churches come together and profess the faith. It would be a huge witness to our over-secularized world, among other things. Now, I know that lots of churches and institutions, ecumenical institutions, are all working on this future anniversary. The Ecumenical Patriarchate in particular are in discussion with the government in Turkey, because in Nicaea, which is 50 miles less from Constantinople, there are a few ruins of a church, not of the time of Nicaea, but at least the tradition is there. This is where it happened. If we could have some sort of event there, that would be great. But the church, the ruins don't belong to the church. They'd be lost long ago. But they have to, he told us how difficult it is to work this out, but he's had it. He's working on it. The World Council of Churches, the Faith and Order Commission, is organizing a great theological assembly event to mark this. And of course, we Catholics are also very much aware of 2025. It will be a Jubilee year. And therefore, there will be so many activities. And I can tell you that in Rome itself, already between the church and the government, there are all kinds of meetings getting ready for 2025 because they expect millions of people. We have millions of people already in Rome now. After COVID, there's an invasion of visitors. But that then, I think, is something that all of us who work in ecumenism can keep in mind as an immediate goal when something good can happen, locally and universally. So thank you all.